The man who killed San Diego police officer Archie Buggs in 1978 is up for parole under a law favorable to those convicted as juveniles. San Diego's police chief turns out to be very good at keeping information from the public. And an Oceanside police shooting shows the difficulty in judging whether lethal force is justified when dealing with the mentally ill. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer. And joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are legal affairs reporter Dana Littlefield of the San Diego Union-Tribune. Hi, Dana.
Hello.
It's good to have you here today. Reporter Liam Dillon, the voice of San Diego. Hi, Liam.
Hi, Mark.
Good to see you back again. And freelance criminal justice reporter Kelly Davis. Hi, Kelly.
Hi, Mark.
Well, it was a senseless and vicious crime. San Diego police officer Archie Buggs was gunned down in 1978. Convicted of the crime was Jesus Salvador Cesena. He was 17 at the time. Now the 54-year-old inmate is again up for parole, and his hearing is today. Dana, review this crime for us. What were the circumstances on that night back in November 1978?
Well, Archie Buggs was out on patrol in the Skyline area. He pulled over, or he stopped a car that was speeding in the area. In it were two known gang members at the time, one of whom was Cesena, and another was a man by the name of Jose Arteaga. Cesena was 17 at the time. His partner in the car was 20 years old. Cesena was driving his mother's car without a license. So he has said later that he panicked. Having been pulled over, he got out of the car, got the gun from his passenger in the car, and fired repeatedly at the officer.
Okay, several shots. Now, has he admitted to killing Officer Buggs?
Well, there was testimony at the trial way back in '79 that he had told his girlfriend at the time. After the shooting, he went to the girlfriend's home, told the girlfriend, I killed a cop. And that he was afraid. He made some comment about being afraid. There was also some testimony that he may have laughed at the time after saying that. So that may be considered a confession. But since then, he has made statements that some believe is taking responsibility since he's been in prison. Others dispute that. And
of course, we'll get into some of that. That's a point of contention at these parole hearings. Now, he's been up for parole several times and denied, but the circumstances have changed. We've got Senate Bill 260. And what difference might it make in a case like this?
Well, Senate Bill 260 basically modified the rules, we'll say, for parole hearings. It basically made the process take into account a person's age at the time he or she committed the crime. So if that person is a juvenile, that is something the parole board is asked to consider when deciding whether or not this person is now suitable for release.
Okay, and that was weighted last time, and that was last year. He was recommended for parole by the board, but he didn't get parole. What happened in that case?
Yes, he was recommended for parole by two members of a parole board, which is the way the process
majority,
works. Yes. Well, there were only two in the parole hearing. So he was recommended for parole, but the governor afterward, Jerry Brown, reviewed that decision, reviewed that recommendation, and rejected it. Determined that Cesena was not ready for parole and that basically he had not fully admitted responsibility or taken responsibility for what he did on that night in '78.
Okay, a little housekeeping question. So he's convicted at age 17 of killing this officer. And what was the actual sentence at that time? Was it 25 to life or?
He was actually sentenced to life without parole initially, but that was modified later by an appellate court who basically gave him life with parole, which essentially boils down to something like 7 years to life. And he has been in prison for more than 30 years since then. And
up for parole more than a dozen times. And until last year's hearing, it had been denied by the board each time. Now, District Attorney Bonnie DeMonis still objects. Chief Shelley Zimmerman, Police Chief Shelley, and many other officers still object to this inmate getting parole. What's their reasoning?
Well, Essentially, they have said that this is a person who is still dangerous, who still poses a public danger, and should not be released from prison. Far be it from me to get in the heads of Shelley Zimmerman or Bonnie DeMannis, but I feel comfortable saying, this man is a cop killer, and so it wouldn't be likely, I think, for either of those two people to recommend that he be released from prison.
And pretty unusual for a DA to go and argue in person before the board?
I would say so. There is a deputy who handles these hearings. His name is Richard Sachs.
So it's his job to actually go and do it normally.
It's his job to go to the prisons and actually argue on behalf of the district attorney's office. But this time, Bonnie DeMannis decided to go in person. And it's worth mentioning also that one of her staff members actually was Archie Buggs' partner back in the 70s. So Jesse Navarro, who works in community relations in the district attorney's office, was Archie Buggs' partner, was there on the scene shortly after Buggs was shot.
All right. Now, on the inmate's side, what's the main argument for granting him parole now? What's his attorney saying, and what's in his favor?
Well, he argues that he's not the same person he was back in '78 when he was
38 years.
Yeah, when he was a 17-year-old kid. He says, he's not that impulsive person or that selfish person that he was back then. He also says that in the decades he spent behind bars, he has actually been active in trying to change himself and to help to change others. He has participated in various programs. He's actually spearheaded some programs to help younger inmates understand what they've done or to help their victims in some way. There was a fundraiser of some type that was organized in prison that Cesenia was a part of. So he says he's a different person. He's gone through counseling and he's become a different person now that he's 54 years old.
All right, and again, as we said, the open Cesenia's hearing is today. How long will we before we know? They're probably not going to come right back with a decision on that.
Well, usually they make the decision the same day.
Oh, they do?
Yes, yes. Now, there's no telling how long that hearing will be. It started this morning.
Okay.
It could go several hours, and there's also the deliberative process. And, I wouldn't wager a guess as to how long that might take.
And then again, the governor has to sign off or could step in at some point as he did last time.
Exactly.
I did want to shift gears before we leave this segment to Prop 47, the law passed by voters in 2014. Tell us briefly, what does that do?
Well, Prop 47 basically reduced some felony crimes to misdemeanors, some lower level nonviolent crimes. So for example, some property crimes where the amount that was stolen or taken is less than $950. Simple drug possession as well. That would no longer be a felony, it's now a misdemeanor. And so those who are, basically you can break down the effect of that law into three categories. You have the people who are now going to be accused of those crimes. Instead of a felony, they'll be accused of a misdemeanor. You have the people who are in custody now serving time on felonies. Well, their felony convictions can now be reclassified as misdemeanors. And then you have those people who have already served their time for their felony convictions. They can have those felonies reclassified retroactively. Okay,
and it affects their record. Now, why was DA DeMannis opposed to such reductions in these sentences for juveniles?
Well, the main argument was that the structure of juvenile court proceedings is different than it is for the adult proceedings. In adult court, one of the main objectives there is punishment. You committed the crime, you're convicted of the crime, you serve out some type of punishment for that. On the juvenile side, it's different. The main goal of juvenile court is not punishment, it's rehabilitation. So the argument there was because of the differences in the system, that retroactive reclassification would not apply.
But she lost on that, and appeals court has...
She did. An appellate court said that all of the components of Prop 47 actually do apply to juveniles as well.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll be watching your reporting, certainly on what happens in the case in Officer Buggs' shooting, and of course see what happens as we go forward with Prop 47. We're going to move on now. Shelley Zimmerman became San Diego Police Chief 18 months ago after her predecessor stepped down following a series of officer misconduct scandals. She vowed to be open, meet with community groups, have no tolerance for wayward officers, and restore the public's trust in the department. But Liam, your story this week portrays a chief far less transparent. Start by telling us where the department ranks nationally in this transparency scale.
Sure. There was a recent study done by a professor at San Diego State, which took a look at police department transparency all over the country, various departments, and they ranked San Diego police near the bottom, especially when compared to other large cities. The transparency score of the San Diego Police Department was, again, close to the bottom when compared to other comparable departments.
And what about in this area?
There were some that were lower, some that were higher, but again, mainly given the size of the department, probably a better comparison would be where they are nationally.
All right. Now, your story, you cite 4 instances where Chief Zimmerman has kept the public in the dark. Let's take them one by one. We'll start with the fatal shooting by an officer of an unarmed man this spring.
Yes, so there is a security camera footage of this entire incident that was taken by a nearby business. The footage, according to someone who has watched it roughly 20 to 30 times, that person said that there was no provocation for the police shooting. And so, there are a number of folks, us, Voice of San Diego, KPBS included, who are pushing a federal court to have that video released. And Zimmerman, however, has refused to make that public, even though at times she has said when there are disputed police shootings, she would consider releasing such video. In this case, now we have one. Hasn't happened. No,
is she saying it's justified to not release it because this is evidence in this case?
That's the argument. Yeah. So under the Public Records Act, evidence is exempt from disclosure. However, that would be a better argument in my view if there was some guarantee that at some point during the process the video would be released under the records law. It doesn't have to be really ever, even if the DA were to decide not to prosecute the case, that would still be, according to the state's law, something they wouldn't have to disclose. But for transparency's sake, especially given there's some dispute, we would argue that this is a relevant issue.
Okay. Now, we do have a bite here. In October last year, Chief Zimmerman appeared. This was a panel for the San Diego chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, talk about the issue of body cameras and transparency. Let's see what she had to say there.
I guess they're looking for more details on the system. Right now is that officers must record all enforcement contacts. And so let me explain to you how the camera works. When the officers go into service, they put the camera on. And the camera is always on a 30-second buffering loop. Once the officer makes an enforcement...
All right, she's explaining there what's happened now. Yeah. But regarding body cameras and all, has she lived up to her promises to make that information public, or have we not had enough instances yet to really test that out?
Well, so it's interesting. So in this particular shooting that we were just discussing, the officer involved did not turn his body camera on. Just another sort of questionable instance related to this particular case. As far as body cameras in general, again, Zimmerman said, "Hey, it's up to me whether I decide whether we're going to release body camera footage." What's interesting about that is when former Chief Lansdowne first pitched the idea of having body cameras, he noted it as a transparency tool. He said, and I'll use a direct quote, "Everyone gets a chance to look at this video." Now, once the City Council passed the body camera legislation to allow the department to buy it, now the department is saying, "Oh, well, this is all evidence now, so no one gets a chance to see it." And so, this is another instance where a tool was being promised as transparency, when instead it's now being really for the eyes only of the police department.
All right, let's get back to our instances cited in your story about the transparency. Next was the investigation of former congressional candidate and city councilman, of course, Carl DeMaio. There was allegations of sexual harassment of a staffer. What happened in that instance?
So there was one specific instance related to this case, which doesn't really fall into the whole evidence argument. If you decide the police department on that, here's a separate sort of situation where DeMaio, when the allegations were first started, said, "I got a call from Shelley Zimmerman, and she told me personally that I was totally cool. There was, the investigation was over,
then
everything was great." Yeah. And so we asked Zimmerman, and she refused to talk about it. And then we said, "Okay, well, we want to see your phone records." and she refused to give those up too, which is interesting because that goes against what her boss says that she should be doing. Mayor Kevin Faulconer, when he was on the campaign trail, said that records related to cell phones, whether they be text messages or call logs, even those on private cell phones that related to public business, were things that should be disclosed. They may not, it's still arguable whether they have to be under the law, but he says they should be. Now, here's an instance again where Zimmerman decided not to do it in contrast with what her boss said should be done. So we never got an answer on that.
All right, we did talk about the body cameras situation, but let's finally cite the reforms the department recommends following this scathing federal critique of the SDPD system, and that was the system to modify and identify, or monitor, that is, and identify problem officers. What about the DOJ report?
Right. So one of the biggest criticisms that Department of Justice leveled at the San Diego Police Department is that their system for monitoring and identifying troubled officers was broken. And again, we all can recall the Anthony Revela situation where we had an officer who, through a number of years, was not identified as someone having problems, even though there were very many clear signs that he was. So the DOJ identified this as a huge problem in the police department. Zimmerman agreed, and in fact, she commissioned an internal report that said, hey, what are we going to do about this? And so we found out the report existed. We asked for it. You
got the report?
Well, we sort of got the report. Okay. So there were 4 pages of recommendations that the officer who wrote the report gave to the chief. But if you take a look at those 4 pages, they're all redacted. So we got not one recommendation that was made to the chief about how to fix his system.
All right, let's ask our other justice reporters on the panel here. Have you had trouble getting information and responses and this overall transparency problem with the police department here?
Not.
Kelly?
Not. They're usually pretty responsive to my questions. I've never asked for any, body camera footage. But one thing that I jotted down here that I thought was interesting from that panel that you played the excerpt from was...
Well, that was a wrong bite, unfortunately.
But she had said this at the panel that she would consider releasing body camera footage if there was a public outcry, and I think she cited Ferguson as an example. Right. That kind of stuff, those kind of protests just don't happen in San Diego. So I'm wondering if what she's doing is fine with her because the public's not complaining
not
about
likely
it. The
to
media
happen,
is, but the public's not really saying anything. So
well, and I would argue that it should take a riot to get public information released, or information that's important for the public to evaluate the performance of the police department. It shouldn't take a riot for that to occur.
It also shouldn't take a court prosecution, I would think. But just building off of something you said earlier, it would be hard to imagine a situation in which a police officer was prosecuted and that footage not be played in court. If it got that far.
Right.
But I do understand that that is a choice on the prosecution's part. They could choose to show that or not, but just sitting here, given all the trials I've seen, it would be hard to imagine that footage wouldn't be played.
Wouldn't come in if it got to the trial.
Right.
All right, well, we'll certainly look to see on this transparency and how this plays out, and as more of these cases, especially involving body cameras, come to the fore. Well, we're going to move on now. Fatal confrontations between police officers and mentally ill suspects have become familiar stories in recent years. But the truth is, we really don't know much about them. Witnesses say a man is, quote, acting crazy. Officers arrive. The suspect is shot. How many such shootings are there in the U.S.? How many are really justified? Kelly, let's start with a local case you reported on in Oceanside. And we've got Oceanside Lieutenant Joe Young. He described what happened. This is courtesy of our partner 10 News.
The male subject became agitated and eventually went to a nearby vehicle that was parked on the side of the road, retrieved a stick from the back of a truck, and made threatening moves toward the officers on scene.
All right, so what did happen? Flush that incident out a little bit for us.
So this was in May of 2012, and a young man named Elwood White, he had never been diagnosed with a mental illness, but there were signs of what could have been early schizophrenia. He had told his dad he was hearing voices 3 weeks before he was killed. He had some sort of a breakdown that day, went on a bit of a violent rampage, was throwing rocks and bottles at people, but clearly something was not right. The call, police were dispatched to a possible 5150, which is a call for someone who's mentally ill
acting out.
And acting out, yeah. So when they arrived, he had kind of armed some people. A couple Marines had tried to subdue him. This was on Oceanside Boulevard. A couple Marines had tried to subdue him, and he had grabbed a broomstick from a maintenance truck and kind of hit one of them and broke the head of the broom off. So when police arrived, he was holding this broomstick, kind of grasping it really close to his chest. And within a couple minutes, he had been shot and killed by one of the sheriff's deputies there. And his family filed a lawsuit.
Because there weren't charges there, it was seen as justified by the criminal side of it.
Correct,
Right?
yeah. So his family filed a civil lawsuit. And the officer who shot him, his argument was that Elwood was wielding this broom handle like a spear and had lunged toward another officer, but all the other witnesses
didn't jive with their accounts.
And the forensic evidence showed that he was grasping it close like this and hadn't made a threatening move.
But the jury found against the White family in that suit, and that's not uncommon, right?
Most of these cases don't, and Dana could probably, they don't make it to trial. They're settled beforehand. So.
Right. But juries tend to want to believe police officers and believe prosecutors' versions of events.
Yeah, and the jury only deliberated for an hour, which really surprised me.
Right.
So.
Well, and a key point that this case brings up is how nobody really knows much about shootings by police. I mean, we follow so many things in our society and our culture and databases on everything, but it's rather surprising that we really don't follow these, right?
Yeah, so I sat in on most of this case, found it really interesting, wanted to write about it, and as reporters do, the first thing I wanted to do is get some statistics on people who are mentally ill who are killed. Is there a breakdown by race? Can that tell us anything? And that data just doesn't exist. No one really tracks it. The the Bureau of Justice Statistics is supposed to, but police departments aren't good at sending their information to the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Sorry.
And nobody's really requiring this, right?
Correct. There was a law that required it. It had lapsed. It's been renewed. It's now in effect. So we'll see if data collection becomes.
And that's a national law, federal law, then?
Federal law, yes.
And then in California, there's a push to create such databases among police departments here.
Yeah, there were two pieces of legislation, and both of them would create a pretty robust, require a lot of data to be turned into the State Department of Justice. And was the person mentally ill? Were they armed? Did the police attempt to use less lethal force? So one of the bills didn't make it out of committee. Another one is still alive. So hopefully, if that gets passed, California might be a state where, it could be a model for that.
Well, the Washington Post is trying to step in, one of our national newspapers, of course, and they're trying to track these shootings. And what specifically is that newspaper doing? They've
got, they've every time they hear about another shooting, and they monitor news reports. Their reporters are out looking for these cases. They add that person to their database, and you could really go in there and you could kind of select how many were mentally ill, how many were armed, white, black, Hispanic.
What have they found so far in terms of mentally ill as we started this segment?
That it was about a quarter of the people killed were mentally ill, but a few people I've talked to said that is probably a really low estimate or low number, and it's much higher than that. Okay. And I looked at the breakdown by race and found that the black suspects who had been shot and killed and were deemed mentally ill were more likely to be unarmed than white suspects.
Now let's turn a little bit to police training. What sort of training do police officers get in dealing with the mentally ill and these kinds of confrontations?
Not much. I'm blanking on PERF, Police Executive Research Forum, put out a great study a couple weeks ago where they had surveyed large police departments and found that training on using your gun, use of force, way up here, lots and lots of training on how to de-escalate a situation, deal with someone who's mentally ill or in crisis, 8 hours of training, not much. It was way down low on the the survey.
Now, are police departments seeing the need to change that? We had another one of these incidents just in the early morning hours today, overnight here in Mission Valley. A fellow with a box cutter running around the employees at a drugstore.
And the case that we're just talking about as far as the security video, that was also a mentally
ill person. So, I mean, as we said at the outset, this happens all the time. Are police departments recognizing this and trying to step up the training?
You hear that. One of the first stories I ever did 15 years ago, as a young reporter, was on a mentally ill suspect, and there were calls for better training after that, but not much has changed. So I don't know. We'll see. All
right, we got a short time left here. What do mental health experts say should be done to minimize the use of lethal force in these confrontations, assuming that that the man is unarmed or certainly not armed with a powerful weapon like a gun?
Just, de-escalation tactics. You have one person giving a command as opposed to everyone yelling. You have less lethal weapons available, and you try those first before the gun. So yeah, there's very clear guidelines on what should be done. It just takes that training so that it becomes, second nature to the officer.
Training does become the key, and as we say, with more research in the databases, that should certainly help that as well. Well, we'll be looking forward to more stories on this important issue as well. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Dana Littlefield, of the San Diego Union Tribune, Liam Dillon of Voice of San Diego, and freelance reporter Kelly Davis. A reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.